Water. If I were called in to construct a religion, I should make use of water. Going to church would entail affording to dry different clothes. My liturgy would employ images of sousing, a furious devout drench. And I should raise in the east a glass of water, where any angled light would congregate endlessly. On the Trent washlands, close to where I grew up, is a small piece of land known as Andrassy Island. It's a very watery place. It sits on the floodplain between two branches of the river and is frequently inundated. It's the site of a holy well and a chapel set up by St Modwyn in the 7th century. There's no trace of the chapel now, but a path brings you to the place where it stood, and in good weather you can sit and listen to the timeless sounds of the river and birds in the cherry trees. A swan glides past, and with the sunlight on its folded wings, it might almost be one of the silver swans that carried Modwyn to heaven when she died at the ripe old age of 133. During her time here, the saint performed a series of miracles, some using water drawn from the holy well and others involving the river itself. On one occasion, she sent two girls on an errand and their boat capsized in a storm. The abbot, Geoffrey of Burton, gives a colourful account of Modwyn weeping and praying until the water parts and a dry path opens up, allowing her to walk to the place where the upturned boat lies on the riverbed. The girls are trapped underneath. She can see the tips of their fingers where they clung in terror to the side of the boat. The priest who has accompanied her tries to shift the boat, but it's far too heavy. At Modwyn's own touch, however, it's miraculously lifted and the girls are found alive. Once they're all aboard, the waters close benevolently and carry them safely home to Andrassy Island. A furious, devout drench, if ever there was one. That pair of adjectives that Larkin uses in his poem Water illustrates the paradoxical nature of this most mysterious substance, its power to flood and destroy, and its value in our spiritual as well as our physical lives. It plays a part in all religions, including the Christianity that Larkin rejected but could never quite leave alone. From baptism to the washing of feet, from the Old Testament accounts of the creation and the flood, to the gospel stories of Jesus walking on water and changing water into wine, it is the very stuff of religious ritual and metaphor. Larkin was often scathing about the accumulated paraphernalia of religious doctrine, pomp and bureaucracy. In contrast, the water at the heart of this poem is pure and transparent. All life truly depends on it, which makes it genuinely holy. The congregation he gathers may be nothing more than light, reflected from random angles, and perhaps he means that to look like a kind of ecclesiastical trick. But it can't help being profound, too, in spite of itself. Water and light, these two essential and eternal elements, are brought together in an act of devotion, which is beautiful and mesmerising. Water itself becomes the object of worship and gratitude. It's a sentiment that finds an echo in another of Larkin's poems, Solar, in which the sun is positioned as a deity and addressed as if in prayer. Unclosing like a hand, you give forever, he writes. Water worship is deeply familiar to me. It underlies the creation myth of my hometown, Burton-on-Trent. The local water hauled up from St Modwyn's well proved to be perfect for brewing, thanks to its unusual hardness, its mix of dissolved minerals. Every Burtonian knew that our water was the best. Honest water, bright and not quite clean, the frankness of limestone, of gypsum, the sour steam of cooling towers, the alchemical taste of brewing. The first Burton ales were brewed by the monks at the Benedictine Abbey just over the river from here, but the glory days were in the 19th century. Past the parish church of St Modwen, and down the long and grimy alleyway known as Andrassy Passage, are what's left of the breweries, their yards and chimneys and towers. When I was a child, they still dominated the town, and it seemed that as long as the miraculous water kept flowing, purpose and significance would flow with it. Now those big breweries are here, but not here. The industry is slimmed down, sleek and odourless. It employs a tiny fraction of the workforce that used to depend on it. Some of the buildings have been demolished, others repurposed. Back in town for the first time in years, I take what bearings I can from them, following a meandering trail through those once familiar streets. I walk on and find my way to the Methodist chapel I attended as a child. It too is here but not here. The building still exists, but it closed to its dwindling congregation years ago and stood empty and sorry for itself for a while before being sold and converted to a 5-bedroom executive home. I was christened in this building, the minister dipping his fingers in the modest font and marking with that famous local water a tiny cross on my forehead which meant belonging. In the photograph taken at the chapel door, I am gowned in white and howling in my mother's arms. Now I look up at the familiar arched doorway, where although the lettering cut into the stone has been blurred by weather, I can still make out the word Wesleyan. The plain brick walls are the same as ever, and the windows of frosted glass I used to gaze at from my place on the pew during the long sermons, dreaming and watching for movement, a branch in the wind or a passing cloud. To me, the world on the other side of the glass was spacious and restless and enigmatic, and I'm often reminded of that feeling when I read Larkin. One of the most frequently recurring objects in his poems is the window, often giving a glimpse of the infinite while at the same time separating us from it. In High Windows he sees the sun-comprehending glass, and beyond it the deep blue air that shows nothing and is nowhere and is endless. In classic Larkin fashion, the poem suddenly expands from its sardonic opening into a larger metaphysical space, one in which rational thought does not provide the answer to every question. Throughout my childhood years, we went to chapel every Sunday, often twice. It was the very source of poetry. I heard it in the sermons, especially those of the old-school local preachers with their fire and brimstone, and in the prayers, which were improvised and spontaneous, and of course in the hymns. As it said in the foreword to the old hymn book, Methodism was born in song. And often there were so many hymns there wasn't room on the wooden board for all the numbers. I followed the tunes in the book, learning to read words and music at the same time, understanding that words are a kind of music. I stand in the road for a long time in front of the chapel. I consider knocking and asking to look inside, but of course I don't. Instead, I nurture the fantasy that the interior has not changed, that the new occupants are living with the same bare, whitewashed walls, hung only with a simple wooden cross, and the plain table that once served as an altar. I imagine them coming downstairs for breakfast and sniffing the faintly gassy smell of the wall-mounted boiler in the tiny adjoining kitchen, where the ladies in their stiff coats are making weak tea for the visiting preacher. In idle moments, perhaps they kneel at the old communion rail, with its row of holes where the miniature glasses would be placed. I remember how into each glass was poured a measure of weak ribena, and into each pair of cupped hands was placed a square of white sunblest. The elemental simplicity of Larkin's constructed religion does not feel remote from that remembered place and the faith that was expressed and shared there. It made use of water. It involved the wearing of different clothes or Sunday best. It employed images of sousing and drenching. Seen in this way, Larkin's poem Water is hardly a tour de force of the imagination, more an approximation to the real thing as I remember it. The glass of water raised in the east would be faintly stained with pink as a reminder of the wine at the Last Supper, but Methodism had grown up hand in hand with the temperance movement, and as there was no trace of belief in literal transubstantiation, Ribena would do just as well. Water would do just as well. Irony and ambiguity are always at play in Larkin's work. Tone shifts, surfaces tilt and slide. In many of his poems, there's a reluctant reaching for something, a kind of thwarted yearning for the numinous or immaterial. He positions himself as a cynic who dismisses all possibility of faith, someone who visits an old church but declares himself sure there's nothing going on inside. But the brashness falters, and atheism collapses into agnosticism. Again and again he concedes that human reason is limited, that we know nothing and are helpless in the face of the ineffable. His ambivalence reaches a kind of apotheosis in Water, where the self-proclaimed atheist adopts a religious calling. It's framed as a kind of thought experiment. There can be no belief, he says. But if there were to be belief, it would have to be constructed through metaphor. Just as St. Modwen's story is built on the miraculous water that surrounds her on Andrassy Island, just as the wealth and pride of my hometown comes from the special water drawn up from the deep aquifer, leaching minerals from the rock on the way, so faith too draws on this same simple, abundant element, for which we all thirst, which can wreck the small boats of our lives, but can also heal and restore our deepest wounds. I no longer practice the Methodism of my childhood, but its gentle rituals, its stories and meanings continue to flow through me, my writing and my life. And so I come back to give thanks at this chapel that is not a chapel. I stand on the wrong side of the electric gate and imagine sneaking up to the door and putting my eye to the keyhole to see the executive in the executive 5-bedroom home. Is he a local man, I wonder? He seems to be a connoisseur of the water. In his hand he has one of those tiny communion glasses which he has found in a forgotten cupboard somewhere. He takes the glass to the tap and fills it carefully. It holds little more than a teaspoonful, and lifts it to his lips. And as the sun slants in through those high windows, the old chapel is once again host to a sparkling congregation of light.